Let's make this awesome together. Whatever you're aiming for, you're in the right place. Let's make it happen. Listen carefully. South Africa stands at the edge of a precipice, its soul battered, its people confused, its destiny hijacked. In this uncompromising expose, we reveal the blueprint for rebuilding a nation that has been systematically dismantled by communist ideology, state dependency, and moral erosion. It is a return to structure, to faith, to family, and to the sacred foundations that once held this country together. This is the anti communist blueprint, a bold, detailed vision for restoring dignity, order, and entrepreneurship to a people misled by slogans and betrayed by their liberators. And it is also a call to arms, a declaration of war, not with violence, but with truth. A battle cry to reclaim the true South Africa, the one built not on class warfare or racial revenge, but on the covenant of difference, mutual respect, and God given unity. This is not reform, it is resistance, resurrection of a nation's soul. The time is now. The war has begun. Now, listen closely. Gather yourself. This is the sound of reclaiming the truth.
There are times in the life of a people when history ceases to be a matter for museums or classrooms and becomes something urgent, aching, and alive. There are moments when what we call politics is no longer just a contest of ideas, but a war for the spirit of a nation. This is one of those moments. What is happening in South Africa currently, or rather since democracy? Are bad things happening in South Africa, as US President Donald Trump observed? We are going to investigate this very carefully, slowly, and deeply. So we ask you to relax, loosen up, and take off your shoes, and learn. Many South Africans are not grounded and rooted. That is the reason they are easily aroused and taken by slogans of varied sorts. We say that you need to understand South Africa, its history, its psychological makeup, and its soul. First thing to grasp is to understand that South Africa is not ANC. It is the direct opposite of ANC. ANC and South Africa are two different opposite things. Not only are they different things, but they do not jive and gel one another. We are going to reveal this to you, and once you know it, you will never be the same again. So, sit quietly and calm. There are all kinds of wars. Wars fought with bullets and wars fought with ideas. Make no mistake, there is a great war going on in South Africa. What follows is not a political treatise, though it speaks of parties and ideologies. It is not simply a manifesto, though it calls for action. It is, in its deepest essence, a meditation on the human condition, seen through the prism of one wounded but majestic country, South Africa. And at the center of this meditation is an image, a symbol, a simple act of imagination. The placing of 4 oranges on the ground to form a square. This square is no ordinary geometry. It is an ancient archetypal shape, revered across cultures, epochs, and civilizations. In the psychology of Carl Jung, the square represents order and wholeness. In sacred architecture from Tibet to Mesopotamia, it signifies stability, justice, and the fourfold nature of the cosmos. In traditional African cosmology, the number 4 often speaks to the totality of the created world: north, south, east, west, earth, fire, water, air, body, mind, spirit, and community. When we draw a square with oranges, one representing the Khoisan, one the Western explorers, one the Bantu-speaking Africans, and one the Indians and Asians, we are not just arranging fruit. We are engaging in an act of anthropological truth-telling. So we are saying, South Africa was not built by one race, nor birthed from one tribe, nor destined to belong to one class. It was and is a convergence, a miracle of coexistence, fragile yet profound. Anthropology teaches us that human cultures do not emerge in isolation. They emerge in contact, conflict, and communion. The Khoisan were not primitive. They were sophisticated in their philosophy, language, and relationship with the land. The Dutch and British did not arrive with mere conquest, but with systems, legal, architectural, agricultural, that became part of the South African fabric. The Bantu-speaking peoples were not one monolith, but many, with languages and traditions as rich and complex as any on earth. The Indians who arrived as indentured workers brought not only labor but cosmology, cuisine, and commerce. Psychologically, we must confront the legacy of these interactions. Colonialism was not benign, nor was it purely malevolent. It was an era of trauma and fusion, exploitation and innovation, degradation and awakening. The psyche of modern South Africa is a layered thing, haunted by pain but also pregnant with possibility. What has emerged is not purity, but plurality, and therein lies its power. But every civilization must decide what story it will tell itself, and herein lies our crisis. The story being told by the ruling elite today is not one of unity and difference, but of division in resentment. It is not a narrative of connection, but one of conquest and revenge. It is, fundamentally, a story written by ideologues, specifically those steeped in the creed of communism, and it is a story that seeks to destroy the square. Communism, as both an ideology and a psychological impulse, always begins with the same premise: that the world must be remade, that history is not a sacred inheritance, but a mistake to be corrected. Its method is erasure. Its tool is class warfare. It sees not oranges connected by lines of common humanity, but compartments of conflict. Black versus white, rich versus poor, male versus female. It weaponizes difference. It inflames wounds. Historically, communism has done this across the globe. In Russia, it crushed the Orthodox Church and slaughtered priests. In China, it turned children against parents during the Cultural Revolution. In Cambodia, it emptied cities and turned scholars into slaves. Always, it seeks to begin the world anew. And always, it leaves ruins behind. And now, it has come for South Africa. But South Africa is not a blank canvas. It is a sacred mosaic. And those who seek to dominate it by rewriting its past must be opposed. Not because we fear change, but because we honor truth. We honor the Khoisan. We honor the Afrikaner farmer. We honor the Indian merchant, the African chief, the Cape Malay imam. Each is a thread. Remove one, and the whole tapestry unravels. The square is fragile. It must be protected. In this manifesto, we do not offer nostalgia for colonialism, nor blind loyalty to capitalism, nor some utopian vision of racial harmony. We offer something more enduring, a covenant of difference, a promise that we can be distinct, even unequal in our histories, and still be bound by mutual respect, law, morality, and faith. This is a philosophical defense of the human spirit. It is a psychological cry against ideological possession. It is an anthropological call to honor the deep roots of our shared soil. It is a historical plea to preserve what is beautiful and hard-won. And yes, it is a political battle cry to rise against those who would tear down the square and replace it with rubble. The war for South Africa is not coming. It is already here. But it is not fought with rifles. It is fought with memory, with imagination, with courage. You are not just reading this. You are entering a struggle, and the first act of resistance is to see the oranges, to draw the lines, to protect the square. Until recently, most people did not even know about other people. Africans, for example, had no contacts with Europeans and Asians. People lived in particular parts of the world and adapted to the exigencies of their world. They evolved particularistic cultures that enabled them to cope with the demands of their world. Culture enables people to adapt to their world. People who adapted to the temperate world of Europe had a particular culture. Those who adapted to the tropical world of Africa evolved a particular culture, and so on. Culture is a living thing. It changes to adapt to changed environments. Today's culture is from yesterday's adaptation to the physical and social environment, hence is already dated and ought to be updated with information from our current experiences. These days, as cultures confront each other and are in an existential fight to die or live, some misguided persons see their culture as static and defend it at all times. They cling to what they call their past culture, unaware that that culture is supposed to change the moment it confronts different environments. A culture that is not dynamic does not enable the people to survive, but in fact, may aid them to die out. A temporary expedient alternative to this misguided behavior is what folks now call multiculturalism. This view believes that all cultures are the same, and that the truth is relative to the culture one came from. In this light, the culture of Hinduism that burned widows with their dead husbands' bodies is seen as the same as the Christian culture that respects all. Life. Culture is the last refuge of the scoundrel. In time, all this cultural relativism nonsense will come to pass. Human beings will let go of their past and evolve a present universalistic culture that adapts to the real world. Improvements in transportation and communication technologies have made it now possible for individuals to travel all over the world. The individual can be in 3 or 4 continents in as many days. This observer has been in North America, flown to Europe and then Africa, all within 2 days. This means that the cultures of the world are now in close contact. Proximity leads to cultural diffusion, which is taking place at a greater speed than at any other time in human history. In the future, it is clear that there will emerge a universal culture that is not anything like today's particularistic cultures. The Oranges of Our Fate. A manifesto against the communist destruction of South Africa. Today, I present to you the true story of South Africa, not in slogans, not in academic riddles, but by a practical demonstration. You are not physically with me, but I have your imagination. And imagination is power. It is the bridge between distance and presence. If you can imagine it, then you are here with me now. Let's begin. I have 4 oranges. I place the first one down. This is the Khoisan, the original sons and daughters of this soil. They've been here for thousands of years, long before any flag was planted. Beneath this orange, I place the second. These are the Western explorers: Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama, Jan van Riebeeck, the Dutch, the French Huguenots, the Germans, and the mighty British. These are not just colonizers. They are builders, engineers, organizers of modern infrastructure, governance, and language that structured the very bones of South Africa. To the right of the Khoisan, I place a third orange. This is the Bantu migration. Africans who moved from Central Africa over centuries, wave after wave, eventually forming a vibrant cultural fabric across this land. And finally, beneath the Bantu orange, the fourth orange, these are the Indians and Asians, brought here as indentured servants who stayed, traded, and contributed immensely to the economy and soul of South Africa. Now I draw lines between them, connecting the Khoisan to the explorers, then to the Bantu, and then to the Indians. What do you have? A square, a perfect diagram, a symbolic architecture of unity, not artificial unity, organic, sacred, and grounded in the soil of South Africa. Each orange is different, but each orange is a citrus. One race, the human race. Separated, yes, but meant to be connected. When connected, they form something perfect, something divine. This is South Africa's natural design. But beware, this diagram is under attack. The African National Congress, ANC, was not always the enemy. It was born in 1912, in a Methodist church in Bloemfontein, under the prayers of Black Christian leaders like John Dewey, Sefako Makato, Sol Plache, Pixley Kaseme, and others. It was an appeal to conscience, an act of unity, a spiritual gathering, not a political machine. The founders were not communists. They were pastors, teachers, and thinkers. They began meetings with hymns, prayer, and Bible readings. Their message was simple. We are one people under God, different in color but united in spirit. They wrote to kings. They sat with mayors. They organized African royalty. They were peaceful visionaries, not agitators of hatred. But something happened, something dark. In the late 1940s, the ANC was hijacked. The communists came in, led by Moses Kotane, Joe Slovo, and eventually Nelson Mandela, and the message changed. No more prayers. No more Bible. No more brotherhood. The fist replaced the cross. Down with whites replaced, let us reason together. Mandela, yes, your saint, was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. He was not a Christian. He divorced his wife Evelyn because she refused to give up her faith. These are his own words, removed from the final version of Long Walk to Freedom. He left faith for revolutionary promiscuity, for moral chaos. He embraced godlessness because communism teaches that Christianity is the opium of the masses. That's why in 1994, South Africa was handed a secular, godless constitution, even though over 80% of South Africans are Christian. This wasn't democracy. This was ideological warfare. Secular means satanic. There's no neutral ground between God and evil. And with that godless foundation came moral collapse. Fatherlessness is now a defining feature of Black South African life. Children born out of wedlock is the norm. Sexual anarchy, glorified by the state, is passed as liberation. Enterprise was crushed. The ANC told Black people, stop building, stop selling. Wait for the state to develop you. They replaced self-reliance with dependency, dignity with slogans, entrepreneurship with grants. Before 1994, Africans built banks, owned cattle, planted maize, ran bakeries and bus lines. After 1994, they were told to sit back and wait for a communist fantasy that never comes. This is not accidental. It is deliberate. The ANC, as it stands today, is an enemy of South Africa, not because it is Black, but because it is communist, and communism does three things. It kills God. It kills enterprise. It kills nations. That's why they shout in stadiums, kill the Boer. That's why the courts say, it's okay. That's why they want to erase the Khoisan, absorb them into the Black identity, and claim there was no white, no Asian, no Khoisan contribution to this land. They want to destroy the square, break the diagram, replace unity with tribal war, replace harmony with race baiting, replace family with fatherlessness, replace faith with political idolatry. And they say all Black political parties must unite. That's not patriotism. That's not unity. That is militarized racialism. That is the language of war. What about the rest of us? If you are South African, you say, let all South Africans unite. Not just Black people. Not just Xhosa. Not just Zulu. Not just comrades. This is why we say, the ANC is not the voice of South Africa. It is the destroyer of South Africa. We don't need a developmental state. We need a liberated people. We don't need revolution. We need restoration. We don't need slogans. We need a covenant of difference. A covenant that says, we are not the same, but we are one. We are not uniform, but we are united. We do not erase difference. We honor it. We do not build communism. We build communities. This is why the South African journey exists. to fight belly to belly with this cancer, to defend this perfect diagram of oranges, to protect a country meant for greatness, sabotaged by those who wave red flags and call it justice. This is a call to conscience, a call to courage, a call to war, not with guns, but with truth, faith, and memory. This is our land, given by God, stitched together by sweat, blood, and faith. Let no man tear it apart. There is something profoundly moving in the simplicity of this image. 4 oranges laid out on the earth, transformed by imagination into a sacred diagram. This is not just a metaphor. It is a spiritual geometry. It reminds us that the human mind, when lit by vision, can see a nation not as a battlefield of tribes, but as a tapestry of inheritances. This is how healing begins, not with policies or manifestos, but with seeing the country whole. The use of imagination as the gateway into history is a radical act. It demands that we stop looking at the past as a burden and begin to see it as a design. 4 oranges, 4 peoples, 4 historical timelines, all distinct, yet forming a square that is more than the sum of its parts. This is anthropology, yes, but it is also prayer. It is a meditation on how civilizations are not forged in the fire of sameness, but in the tension of difference. The Khoisan, the original children of this soil, are not invoked here as museum pieces, but as the cornerstone. They are not included out of guilt, but out of truth. Their presence at the top of the square signifies the spiritual memory of this land, the kind that cannot be replaced or rewritten. They are not victims. They are origin. Beneath them, the Western explorers appear, not as evil incarnate, but as contributors to the formation of modern systems, roads, ports, schools, governance. These explorers, often vilified wholesale, are acknowledged here not to justify colonialism, but to locate it in history's mosaic, not as a final word, but as a brushstroke in a much larger canvas. To the right, the Bantu-speaking Africans, migrants, builders of kingdoms, bearers of language and rhythm, and below, the Indian and Asian communities, arriving through bondage, staying through tenacity, and transforming their trauma into culture, trade, and kinship. Together, these 4 stand as living symbols of what South Africa is at its best. Not a melting pot, but a grid of difference held together by mutual presence. A square, mathematically perfect, spiritually balanced. But this square is not permanent. That is the warning. It is a delicate structure, and the moment we forget how it was formed, or worse, seek to unmake it in the name of ideology, we descend into chaos. That is why imagination is not just power, but responsibility. To imagine is to choose whether to see a fragmented battlefield or a sacred unity. This first chapter reminds us that national unity is not forged by force, nor by political decree. It is imagined, then nurtured. It begins in the mind, then becomes policy, then becomes culture. If we lose the vision of the square, we lose the soul of South Africa. In a time of rage and slogans, to sit and imagine a square of oranges is a radical act. It is an act of restoration. It is the beginning of a new politics, one that starts not with what we must fight, but with what we must protect. And so, this chapter does not merely teach, it invites. It invites us to pick up the thread of imagination and reweave the South African story, not with erasure, but with reverence. Reflections. The forgotten altar of liberation. To understand the soul of the original African National Congress is to step into a sanctuary, not a strategy room. Before it was politicized, the ANC was consecrated. Before it was a movement, it was a prayer. Born in a Methodist church in 1912, the ANC did not rise from rebellion, But from reverence, its founding was not a clenched fist, but a bowed head. In the presence of men like John Dube, Sol Plaatje, Sefako Makato, and Walter Rubusana, the struggle for justice took the shape of moral persuasion, not ideological violence. These were not party cadres. They were preachers, teachers, poets. They began their meetings with Bible readings and gospel choruses. Their appeal was not to Marx or Lenin, but to God and conscience. They believed that injustice must be fought, yes, but with the sword of truth, not the hammer of vengeance. Their fight was a spiritual one, to awaken South Africa to its higher calling, to pierce through the racism and cruelty not with slogans, but with the radiance of Christian brotherhood. They believed in a South Africa not fractured by tribalism, nor poisoned by retaliation, but healed through covenant. The fact that white missionaries prayed alongside them, that Afrikaner pastors supported their founding efforts, tells us that the ANC was never about black supremacy. It was about divine justice. Its founders did not envision a monochrome future, but a multiracial harmony. They wrote letters to kings and sat with mayors not to overthrow them, but to plead for recognition of shared humanity. And yet, this altar was forgotten, buried beneath the rubble of revolution. The founding spirit of the ANC, its Christ-centered ethic, was quietly assassinated long before bullets flew. It was replaced by another spirit, secular, godless, vindictive. To recover that altar is to remember that the ANC was once a vision of reconciliation, not a mechanism for dominance. It is to recall that true liberation was once understood as moral responsibility, not merely political power. It is to recognize that the ANC did not begin with communists. It began with Christians. And if South Africa is to be healed, it must return to this sanctuary, not to recreate the past, but to remember what made it sacred, not to repeat history, but to redeem its soul. The ANC did not begin with the shout on of war. It began with the whisper of faith. And until that whisper is heard again, the dream remains lost. The communist hijack reflections. When the fire entered the temple, every nation has its moment of betrayal. An hour when what was sacred is sold, when the altar is defiled, and when the language of peace is replaced by the drumbeat of ideology. For the African National Congress, that moment came in the shadows of the 1940s and 1950s. This was not just a political realignment. It was a spiritual coup. The communists did not march in with weapons. They walked in with ideology, quietly, gradually, relentlessly. They replaced the hymn book with the manifesto, the psalm with the pamphlet, the brotherhood of man with the dialectic of class war. What began as a movement of conscience was now overtaken by a strategy of conquest. Men like Moses Kotane and Joe Slovo, clever and calculating, understood what communism always understands, that to control a nation, you must first control its soul. And Mandela, charismatic, bold, and tragically seduced, became the perfect vessel. He abandoned his Christian roots, disavowed his wife Evelyn for her faith, and swore allegiance to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The altar was now an armory. The spirit was now a system. Psychologically, this was a profound shift. The ANC no longer offered a dream. It offered a target. No longer did it gather in churches to sing. It gathered in secret to strategize. The language of liberation morphed into the language of vengeance. Instead of saying, "We are one," they began to chant, "Down with the enemy." And who was the enemy? First, it was the white man, then the capitalist, then the Christian. Eventually, it became anyone who dissented from the new gospel of Marx and Lenin. Communism thrives by division. It feeds on the fracture. It cannot tolerate reverence, only revolution. Anthropologically, the danger of such a shift is immense. It tears apart the bonds of kinship, undermines the family unit, and turns identity into a weapon. Children were taught to hate. Elders were silenced. culture was not preserved. It was politicized. Everything that gave life its rootedness, faith, family, community, was now seen as an obstacle to be dismantled in the name of the so-called revolution. This was not transformation. It was desecration. It was, quite literally, the fire entering the temple. We must say this with clarity. Communism did not liberate South Africa. It colonized the ANC, and in doing so, it set the nation on a course of decay masked as development, of slogans standing in for strategy, and of spiritual famine dressed as political freedom. To reclaim South Africa, we must first tell the truth about this betrayal. We must mourn what was lost, and we must cleanse the temple, not with violence, but with vision, not with rage, but with restoration. Only then can the ANC, or whatever rises in its place, return to being what it once was, a vessel for the moral imagination of a people. Let us be clear. The revolution may have taken the building, but the spirit still waits outside, asking to be let back in.
Chapter 8. The Entrance of Nelson Mandela. Interrupted Convergence. When the Wildcat Swung. By the late 1940s, two forces were evolving, slowly, clumsily, but not without promise. On one side, Afrikanerdom was shedding its old fear of British domination and solidifying its grip on power. After decades of trauma, from the scorched earth of the Anglo-Boer War to the humiliation of the British flag waving over Pretoria, the Afrikaner was no longer just surviving. He was building schools, banks, newspapers, political machines, a language, an economy, a nation, all of it slowly rising from the ashes of 1902. On the other side, the ANC was also maturing. From a gathering of intellectuals and chiefs in Bloemfontein, it had grown into a platform of dignity, a place for dialogue, negotiation, petitions, and principle. Leaders like Dr. A.B. Zuma and Dr. James Moroka believed in engagement, not anarchy. They had no illusions about white power, but they still believed that justice could be reasoned with. These were men of wisdom and wits, not sabers. They petitioned the crown. They wrote letters instead of lighting fires. Their strength was moral, not militant. Calm and collected. Men of character. There was underneath all the noise a slow convergence happening. Painfully slow but natural. Afrikaner nationalism and African nationalism were beginning to walk the same road, even if on opposite pavements. Then came the wild swing, the wildcat called Nelson Mandela. I called him cancer and a demon. I will tell you the reasons why, by and by. Just be patient and do not boil. At the tail end of the 1940s, a young, impatient, confident man entered the scene. His name was Nelson Mandela. He did not come with a voice of prayer or a pen of protest. He came swinging, like a wild cat in a delicate room of dialogue. He was charming but disruptive, brave but blunt. He wanted action, confrontation, and change now. And for that, many adored him. But let us speak the truth. Nelson Mandela interrupted the evolution of the ANC. He brought with him a new militancy, shaped not by the humble wisdom of Moroka or Rubusana, but by Marxist fire and communist doctrine. He aligned with global revolutionaries, who did not understand South Africa's long, complex threads of negotiation and nuance. He saw slow progress as betrayal. He preferred agitation to argument, the fall of Moroka, and the rise of fire. In 1952, at the height of the Defiance Campaign, Mandela accused the old wise man Dr. James Moroka, then president of the ANC, of cowardice and weakness. Moroka, a Christian, doctor and a man of deep humility, had pleaded for moderation. He had warned of chaos and called for calm mind and wisdom. For that, he was humiliated by communist-controlled Nelson Mandela, pushed aside and cast out by the very movement he had led. His dignity meant nothing. He was pushed from his chair by Nelson Mandela and fell on the ground in sorrow and shame, and communist-controlled Nelson Mandela laughed and proclaimed victory over the old wise man. He pushed him down from the chair. The Congress was no longer a gathering of elders and educators. It was becoming a battleground. Mandela, with his comrades in the ANC Youth League, redirected the river, and it has flowed that way ever since. Today the marks remain. The ANC, once rooted in Christian values, African customs and constitutional reasoning, was infiltrated by communist ideology, foreign slogans, clenched fists, and militant posturing. Even today, the party's internal contradictions echo from that pivot. Nelson Mandela would go on to suffer nobly, to become a global icon, but we must still say it, he broke the line of the founding fathers. He broke away from African values, African ways of seeing things, and fell to the spell of communism became he a cancer and a demon. Communism is destructive, not constructive. While these African leaders were evolving in natural evolution, the communist-controlled Nelson Mandela was devolution, the very opposite of Africanism, wild and wired to communism, a foreign ideology that he imposed on African values of wisdom, humility, and calmness in the midst of storms and frustrations. He abandoned their method, their patience, their belief in persuasion over revolution. History demands we speak both grace and grit. This is not an attack. It is a reckoning. Mandela was many things, necessary, magnetic, courageous, but he was not a continuation of Makato, John Dewey, Oswald Plaatje, Pixley Kasemi. He was oid. He soared. Tares not wheat. He broke the harmony and the gradual evolution of South Africa, and history must be brave enough to hold both truths. That a legend rose, and in doing so silenced a lineage of dialogue and wisdom that was already building and mellowing to something real. We must learn from that, not in bitterness, but in balance. Chapter 9. Mandela, a hero, but whose son was he? Let's dismantle the shrine, not out of bitterness, but for the sake of truth. Let's turn this chapter into what it truly must be: a historic reckoning, a moral confrontation, and an unveiling of the man behind the monument. This is the chapter that won't be taught in schools, but must be felt in the bones of every thinking South African. South Africa is trapped in a cathedral of edited memory. The man on the banknotes, the statue in Sandton, the name on every hospital, school, and highway. We are taught not to think about him, only to thank him. But a free country does not fear questions, and a mature nation does not preserve its myths at the expense of its memory. So let us ask again, with boldness, with precision, whose son was Nelson Mandela really? He was born in light. He was born in the hills of the Eastern Cape, a region soaked in the sacred. A land walked by Tiosoga, the first black ordained Presbyterian minister in Southern Africa. A land where Christian mission schools taught not just arithmetic, but character. Where manhood was defined not by militancy, but by moral excellence. Mandela was shaped by the Methodist order. He was surrounded by black leaders of discipline and dignity. Men like Sefako Magato, the second president of the ANC and a towering Methodist figure. Magato was a man who believed in order, dialogue, faith, and African honor. Mandela once said he was spellbound by Makato's moral power. So moved was he that when his first son was born, he named him Makato Mandela, not after an ancestor, but after a spiritual father. That naming was not casual. It was reverent. Mandela began his journey under the guidance of African Christian moral giants, but he did not remain under their shadow. Then he turned. Mandela married Evelyn Mace, a nurse and devout Christian, a woman of quiet strength, prayer, and tradition. But their marriage was crushed under the weight of political ambition. He accused her of being too religious, too reserved, too committed to values he no longer held. What really happened? Mandela began walking away, not just from Evelyn, but from everything he was raised to honor. He admitted it himself. After I left Evelyn, I followed a path of immoral life. That sentence, his own words, was removed from Long Walk to Freedom. Censored. Scrubbed by editors who wanted a saint, not a soul, but truth cannot be censored from the heart of a nation. And Mandela knew. He had crossed a moral line. He had left not just a wife, but a path. He abandoned the tradition of Magato, Dube, Rubusana. He no longer walked in the rhythm of African Christian moral clarity. He entered a new hall. The Marxist temptation. Mandela traded robes for rhetoric. He fell into the embrace of white Marxist intellectuals, Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Moses Kotane, Ronnie Kasserils, Ben Turok. He sat at their tables. He read their books. He quoted their gods, Lenin, Marx, Trotsky. Gone were the echoes of the Psalms. Gone were the proverbs of the elders. Gone was the humility of African fathers who understood power as service, not spectacle. He walked out of the church and into the chambers of ideology. He raised a clenched fist where once he would have bowed his head in prayer. A black man in white costume. Let us ask a harder question. What do we call it when a black man raised in royal tradition, mission school discipline, and African ancestral pride abandons all of it to imitate European revolutionaries? Is that evolution? Or is that sophisticated imitation? Is that progress or an inferiority complex dressed in red rhetoric? He did not seek to build from our spiritual foundations. He reached for foreign fire and carried it like a torch. Not seeing it would burn the very moral framework that raised him. He left the fathers behind. He stopped quoting Tiosoga. He stopped speaking with the voice of Rubusana. He no longer thought like Magatho. He postured in courtrooms. He marched with fists instead of moral authority. He swapped ancestral wisdom for borrowed slogans. Yes, he became an icon. But icons can be interrogated, and we must say it plainly. Mandela did not continue the line of the founding African leaders. He strayed from the path of African measured wisdom. He broke it, and South Africa has never returned to that moral lineage. The cost of the pivot, he chose militancy over memory. He chose ideology over integrity. He chose white communists over black Christian elders, and we are still living with the consequences. It no longer values humility. It rewards applause. Why? Because the moral compass was abandoned. And when the leader walks off the path, the people soon follow. This chapter is not written in bitterness. It is written in love of truth. And we must ask, what would South Africa have looked like if Mandela had remained faithful to the path of Sefako Magato? What if he had led not with foreign fire, but with African calm, humble light? These are not accusations. They are inquiries.
Communism has got nothing in common with African values of growth and patience. Communism seeks to destroy what is there. African values and traditions are predisposed in the natural order of things that change by evolution, steeped in spirituality. Everyone knows that communism is a godless monstrosity. African values respect and nurture the idea of a family. Communism sees the family as the enemy, for it seeks control of the people. To have a family and parents in control of their children is against communism. Communism wants to control and support those children, give them social grants. African values appreciates the spirit of enterprise and individual creativity. Communism is about equality and collectivization. So Nelson Mandela abandoned African Christian values and got baptized into the religion of godless communism. That is what it is. He literally and openly denounced African Christian values and, according to his words, went on a path of an immoral life. This is what he said himself. He divorced his wife Evelyn because she was a Christian. That is exactly what Mandela says in his Long Walk to Freedom book. The ANC was founded by men and women of Christian faith. There was no communism in the midst of the ANC. The ANC was founded in 1912 in Bloemfontein by Christians. The event opened up with prayer, not amandla. They were gospel songs in the midst of the speeches. The atmosphere was of calm, wisdom, and prayer, not fiery rhetoric. And that continued for 3 decades until that Nelson Mandela appeared and crushed this spirit. Drunk with the fiery communist spirit was destruction, Nelson Mandela set himself diametrically opposed to those who built the ANC, those who came ahead of him. He became a pupil and student of communists like Joe Slovo and was like a puppet used by these communists to enter into the realm of Africans' worldview and tear down African values and replaced with communism. And that is where we are now. That is where South Africa is now, ruled and governed by communist ANC. Let me repeat, communism has absolutely nothing in common with the core of African values, where African tradition teaches growth, patience, respect for the spiritual order, and evolution through wisdom. Communism charges in like a wrecking ball. Its very essence is destruction. Communism does not build, it dismantles. It does not nurture, it seizes and controls. African values are rooted in spiritual consciousness. They honor family. They uphold the dignity and sacred role of parents, elders, and community. In contrast, communism views the family as an obstacle to the control it seeks. It aims to control the soul of the youth, reshape them through ideological manipulation, and erase the inherited wisdom of their traditions from family. Let it be known, Nelson Mandela turned his back on African Christian values. He did not walk the path of our forefathers. He denounced the morality of his Christian upbringing and publicly confessed to adopting what he called and immoral life. These are his own words in Long Walk to Freedom. He left his wife Evelyn because she was a devout Christian. That is a fact. That is his words, and that is the path he chose. The ANC was not born of Marxist fire. It was born of Christian faith and African dignity. Founded in 1912 in Bloemfontein, the ANC's birth was wrapped in gospel hymns, prayer, and wise deliberation, not in militant slogans or ideological warfare. For 30 years, the ANC was a place of spiritual resolve, moral clarity, and unity in vision. Then came Nelson Mandela, and everything changed. Drunk on the doctrine of destruction, Nelson Mandela did not continue the legacy of the founders. He betrayed it. Under the influence of communists like Joe Slovo, he became a vessel, a puppet, a carrier of foreign ideologies designed to tear down African spiritual worldview. He was no longer walking in the steps of Sefako Magatho, John Dewey, Pixley Kaseme, and Walter Rabusana. He was marching to the drumbeat of Karl Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and with him came the slow poisoning of African values in South African governance. This is why today, South Africa is ruled by this ANC. An ANC that sees people as beneath them, deliberately go on course to block their progress and development so that they are able to control them through social grants dependency. This is not progress, having almost every black child hooked on social grants. This is not freedom. This is cultural suicide. More than 60% of kids are fatherless because communism says you must free the human body from morals. That is one of the tenets of communism if you do not know. It says be free, go out that and enjoy yourself. Communism is anti-family, anti-spiritual, anti-moral, and those who led us into its arms turned their backs, not only of Christianity, on the soul of African values.
This is the truth that must be said. Mandela remained a committed Marxist to the end, not in name only but in tone, language, and spiritual omission. His speeches are echo chambers of ideology, not prayers of a man who feared or revered God Almighty. And that silence speaks louder than all his applause. Too many people throw the word communist around without knowing its spiritual DNA, that at its core, communism sees God as a threat to state control and faith as a rival to political ideology. Here is a sharp and educational insight. Sidebar. Communism is godless, by design, not by mistake. Many today don't realize that communism is not just an economic theory. It is a complete belief system, a worldview, a religion of its own. And at the center of that system is this declaration: there is no God, not metaphorically, not as opinion, but as doctrine. Marx hated God. The father of communism, Karl Marx, did not merely ignore God. He declared war on religion. He called religion the opium of the people, the sigh of the oppressed creature. To Marx, faith was weakness. God was a delusion used by the rich to pacify the poor, and in the world he imagined, God had no place. Lenin enforced it. Vladimir Lenin, the man Mandela admired through communist doctrine, took Marx's ideas further. He said, every religious idea, every idea of God is unutterable vileness of the most dangerous kind. Under Lenin, churches were burned, priests were executed, Christian texts were banned. God had to be removed so the state could become supreme. Communism needs a godless society to work. Here is the core truth. Communism cannot survive where people fear God more than they fear government. If there is a higher law, then the state cannot be absolute. If there is a divine judge, then the Politburo cannot control truth. If people believe in heaven, then they won't worship revolution as salvation. So the solution? Erase God. That is what communism has always done. In Russia, in China, in Cuba, in North Korea, and subtly in South Africa through ideological infiltration. Communism and the ANC. When the ANC aligned itself with communist ideology in the 1950s and 60s, it imported more than strategy. It imported a worldview that sidelined prayer, moral accountability, and divine purpose. Even leaders raised in church, like Mandela, began to speak only of the people, the struggle, the movement, never of God, righteousness, or blessing. And that shift was spiritual sabotage. The people forgot their source. So today, when young South Africans chant struggle songs but do not kneel before their creator, when politicians speak of transformation but not of truth, when leaders demand loyalty but not holiness, know this: It is not by accident. It is the residue of a godless ideology. Communism taught us to organize power, not to honor the highest power, and we are still suffering under that lie. The way back if South Africa is to heal, it must not only fix its policies, it must rediscover its reverence. We must return to the way of Sefako Makato, to the God of Tiosoga, to the humility of the mission fathers, to the African path where leadership bows before the Almighty, not before Moscow, because a godless struggle can win the war, but it cannot bless the nation. Chapter 11. The people always, until they're not. There's a sickness, an inherent sickness within communist ideology. It starts with seductive talk, words like equality, justice, the people, freedom from oppression. But always, it ends the same way. A bloated elite speaking on behalf of the poor while living off their backs. The fat cats of the people communists are master illusionists. They speak in the name of the worker, but never pick up a shovel. They claim to represent the hungry, but dine well in central committees. They hate capitalism, but live in its luxuries once they capture the state. From Moscow to Havana, from Beijing to Johannesburg, the pattern repeats like a virus. And here in South Africa, we've seen it with chilling familiarity. Leaders in red berets shout power to the people while they drive German sedans. They shout expropriate the land while sipping fine whiskey in gated suburbs. They talk anti-imperialism while vacationing in Dubai. This isn't revolution. It's political cosplay soaked in hypocrisy and self-worship. Let's talk about their god, Lenin. Let's strip away the romance and face facts. Vladimir Lenin is the saint of communism, the Red Prophet, the one who supposedly liberated the Russian people from the Tsar. But what did he actually do? He murdered, massacred, starved his own people, and built a secret police, Cheka, that tortured dissidents and burned books. He introduced red terror, not peace, censorship, not dialogue, forced collectivization, not shared prosperity. The Russian Civil War under Lenin saw millions of deaths. Peasants were slaughtered, priests were executed, intellectuals fled or were silenced. And even as he preached dictatorship of the proletariat, he became the dictator. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelette, they said. But those eggs were human lives. And the omelette? A state built on fear, lies, and unmarked graves. Always the same song, it's always the same. They speak for the people. Until the people ask questions, then come the boots. Then come the secret arrests. Then come the ration lines, the currency. Collapse, the surveillance, and the fear. They abolish religion, not because it's false, but because faith competes with their authority. They destroy family values because loyalty to blood threatens loyalty to the party. They don't free people. They dominate them culturally, spiritually, politically. Why we must reject it every time? Mandela may have been seduced by the red gospel of struggle. Many in the ANC still are. But we must say it clearly now. Communism does not liberate. It replicates oppression under new branding, and always in the name of the people. But look at the people. Are they rising? Or are they queuing for crumbs while the cadres sit fat at the buffet of power? Let us never be fooled again. We don't need Marx to love justice. We don't need Lenin to fight inequality. We don't need red flags to restore the dignity of black South Africans. We need wisdom, not ideology. Self-reliance, not dependency. Truth, not propaganda. Real moral leadership, not firebrand speeches from political actors who hate capitalism. By day, but love Gucci by night. Let us throw off the red costume. Let us return to our own ancient path. African, rooted, disciplined, dignified. Because the people have suffered enough. They don't need more slogans. They need honesty.